burning. That was the only word Arya had left for what was happening inside her chest. Not pain exactly, not the clean snap of a broken bone or the bright bloom of a cut, but something older and more patient than either. Something that had started as a swallowed coal and had become, in the space of 37 minutes, a slow and thorough incineration working its way upward from her stomach toward the base of her throat. She did not make a sound. She pressed her back against the cold face of the granite shelf that jutted from the mountain's inner wall, pulled her knees to her chest, and breathed through her nose in the careful, metered intervals she had taught herself years ago, when sound had meant survival and silence had meant the same thing. The tunnel was dark enough that she could not see her own hands. She knew they were shaking because she could feel the vibration in her palms where they were pressed flat against the stone, but she did not look at them. Looking would not make them stop. The ember, what remained of the Ashvale Pack's sacred fire, the coal that had been kept alive for 260 years through war and plague and 3 separate relocations, was inside her now. It was the size of her thumbnail. It had been wrapped in a triple fold of treated membrane, the kind the pack healers used for internal poultices, and she had done the calculation before she swallowed it. The membrane would hold for approximately 2 hours before the stomach acids dissolved it. 2 hours was enough. 2 hours was either enough or it was not going to matter at all. She had swallowed it 11 minutes before the traitors came through the hall. She could hear them still, on the other side of the granite shelf, moving through the archive chamber, with torches, and the flat, efficient voices of men who had already decided what they were looking for and were not worried about being overheard. She recognized 2 of the voices. One belonged to Elder Crest, who had sat at the high table every harvest feast for as long as Arya could remember, and who had once, when she was 12, and had accidentally knocked a serving platter into his lap, looked at her as though she was something that had crawled in from the outer forest and failed to crawl back out again. The other voice she could not name, but she knew its accent. It was from the valley settlements, from the cluster of packs that had been sending envoys to the Ashvale borders for the past 3 seasons, under the pretense of trade negotiations. They were not looking for the Ember. They did not know about the Ember. What they were looking for was the lineage record, the sealed archive that documented every bloodline in the pack for the past 8 generations, the document that would prove or disprove the succession claim that Elder Crest had been quietly building for the past 2 years. Arya had hidden the record also, but in a different place, and she had done it before the Ember became necessary. She had been the pack's archive keeper for 6 years. She had held the title of 3rd Record Warden, which was the lowest of the 3 warden ranks, and which came with a storage alcove barely large enough to turn around in, meals taken after the rest of the hall had finished, and a level of social visibility approximately equal to the mortar between the stones. People did not see 3rd Record Wardens. They saw the archive. They saw the title. They walked past the person who inhabited it, the way they walked past a well-maintained door. This had, over 6 years, become extraordinarily useful. The ember burned on. She pressed the back of her hand to her sternum, not to comfort herself, but to feel whether the heat was visible from outside, which she knew was irrational, which she did not care about. The treated membrane was holding. The ember was alive inside her. She could feel it the way you feel a swallowed ember when there is nothing else in the literature or the living world to compare it to, which is to say, she felt it as a thing that should not be there, a wrongness that was also somehow, in the specific context of this specific dark tunnel, on this specific night, exactly right. The sacred fire of the Ashvale Pack was alive because she had put it inside her body. That was the truth of it. All the rest of it, the pain, the shaking hands, the careful breathing, was just the cost of the truth, and she had known the cost before she paid it. She had been knowing costs like this her whole life. She was rather good at it by now. 26 minutes since she'd swallowed it. 11 minutes since the traitors came through the hall. 1 hour and 49 minutes of membrane integrity remaining, if her estimate was correct. She breathed. The coal burned. She did not make a sound. That was 3 years ago. No, that is not yet the right place to begin. Begin here instead, 6 years before the tunnel, in the autumn that Arya arrived at the Ashvale stronghold for the first time, 17 years old, and carrying everything she owned in a canvas pack that had once belonged to her mother and that still smelled, faintly, of her mother's preferred thread wax, cedar and clove. She had come from the Mirren border settlements, a cluster of small omegas and unmated betas, mostly, who scraped a reasonable living from the trade routes that ran between the eastern mountain passes and the valley floors. Her mother had been the settlement's record keeper, a woman of no particular rank and considerable particular skill, who had died of a lung sickness 3 winters before Arya's 17th birthday, and left her daughter 2 things, the canvas pack and the ability to read and transcribe in 4 languages, including the old formal script that most working archivists had stopped learning a generation earlier because the only documents still written in it were the oldest and most legally significant ones. It was this last inheritance, the old formal script, that had gotten her the apprenticeship at Ashvale, not by impressing anyone, precisely. The sitting first record warden had sent a general notice to the border settlements asking if any scribes were available with old script competency, framed as a formality, clearly not expecting a response. Arya had written back the same day. The warden had written back 3 weeks later, the response terse and not particularly welcoming, informing her that the position was unpaid for the first year and that she would be expected to supply her own materials. She had arrived on the 14th day of the harvest month, and the first person she met at the gate was a senior beta guardsman who looked at her canvas pack and her travel-worn clothes and the slight frame that was a common enough Omega inheritance, and asked her, without malice, but without any particular warmth either, whether she was here for the domestic placements or the guest wing. She told him she was the new archive apprentice. He had looked at her for a moment with an expression she would come to recognize over the following years as the specific face people made when reality declined to cooperate with their expectation. Then he had let her through. The archive was on the eastern side of the stronghold, occupying 3 connected rooms on the 2nd level, a main reading chamber, a storage room, and a narrow processing alcove where new materials were sorted and prepared. Arya was given the alcove. She was given a cot that folded down from the wall, a small iron stove that required precise management to maintain anything other than a glacial temperature, and a list of current projects that the first and second wardens had assigned her without asking her name. She learned their names from the duty roster. She assumed they knew hers from the same source. 3 weeks passed before she discovered that the first warden consistently referred to her in his notes as the new girl, and 4 months before she was reasonably certain the second warden could not have identified her in a crowd. She minded it less than she expected. The work was good. The old formal script was everywhere in the Ashvale archive, in the founding documents, in the bloodline records, in the sealed succession materials that the first warden never opened himself, but which Arya, by the end of her 2nd year, was the only staff member qualified to read. She was careful with this. She did not draw attention to it. She transcribed what she was asked to transcribe, and catalogued what she was asked to catalogue, and spent the remaining hours of her working days, which was most of them, because the alcove offered no particular incentive to stop working, learning the physical geography of the archive as thoroughly as she had learned its written contents. By the end of her 3rd year, she knew every load-bearing wall, every drainage channel, every concealed access point. She knew where the granite shelf met the inner mountain wall and left a gap of approximately 1 shoulder width, accessible through a ventilation passage that had been recorded in the original fortress plans, and then, for reasons not documented, omitted from all subsequent surveys. She knew this because she had read the original fortress plans. She was promoted to 3rd record warden at the start of her 4th year. The ceremony, such as it was, consisted of the first warden handing her a new duty roster with the title at the top. She thanked him. He walked away. She went back to the archive and kept working. The trouble with Elder Crest began in her 5th year, though she had been watching the signs of it for nearly a year before it became, in her assessment, a genuine threat. She had a precise and thorough system for distinguishing between the two categories, things that required monitoring and things that required action, a system she had built not from any formal training, but from 6 years of reading documents that powerful people believed no one could read, and from the particular kind of attention you develop when no one is paying attention to you. What she saw, beginning in the early months of her 5th year, was this. Elder Crest was making copies of bloodline documents, not officially, not through the archive request process that required his name and purpose on a registered slip that Arya filed and retained. He was doing it through an intermediary, a young beta scribe who had joined the archive staff 6 months earlier and who had, Arya noticed, an unusually detailed knowledge of when the 1st and 2nd wardens were away from the reading chamber. She did not confront the scribe. She did not report the copies to the 1st warden. What she did was make her own copies of the originals before the intermediary could alter them, and she filed those copies, sealed in the old formal script that the intermediary could not read, in a location she chose, with the same care she applied to everything. She chose the ventilation passage behind the granite shelf. By the time she entered her 6th year, she had a complete, authenticated, sealed set of the lineage records, and she had a very clear picture of what Elder Crest intended to do with the falsified version. He intended to invalidate the current Alpha King's succession claim and establish an alternate line, one that would place a series of Valley Alliance pacts in a position of consolidated power. The current Alpha King, Dorian, of the Stonecrest royal line, who had held the kingship for 8 years and whose territory encompassed Ashvale and 14 other pacts, would be displaced not by force, but by paperwork, by a succession argument made in front of the old formal council and supported by documents that no one present could fully read. No one except Arya. She had spent 3 months deciding what to do about this, and she had arrived at a plan that was, she acknowledged to herself with a kind of dry clarity that had always served as a substitute for self-pity, not a plan that prioritized her own survival above everything else. It was a plan that prioritized the fire. The sacred ember had been in the pack's keeping since the founding. It was the oldest living thing in the stronghold, maintained in a carved ironstone vessel in the consecrated alcove off the main hall, tended by whoever held the hearthkeeper role. The ember had survived a great many things. It had not survived, in the accounting of its 260 years, an attempt to use it as a hostage, which was what Arya calculated Elder Crest's associates in the Valley Pacts would do once they controlled the stronghold. The ember was leverage. It was the oldest and most irreplaceable symbol of Ashvale's identity, and people like Elder Crest and his Valley associates understood leverage in the precise, unsentimental way that Arya had come to understand everything. She had taken the ember from its vessel on the night the Valley envoys arrived. Not all of it, which would have been impossible, but the heart of the coal, the oldest part of the fire, which the hearthkeeper had shown her once, 3 years ago, pointing to the center of the glow with a kind of reverent precision. She had prepared the membrane weeks before, researching the correct treatment method in a medical text she had borrowed and returned without noting in the request log. She had folded the coal into the membrane in the archive alcove, working by feel in the dark, because she had not wanted the light visible under the door. And then she had swallowed it. because there was no other place to put it that they would not find, because her body was the one hiding place that had 6 years of practice at being overlooked, because the fire had kept the pack alive for 260 years, and she was the only one awake and in position to keep it alive for one more night. That was the calculation. It was not, she thought, a complicated one. It was just expensive. The Ember had been inside her for 47 minutes when the traders finished searching the archive chamber and moved on to the consecrated alcove to find the vessel empty. She heard Elder Crest's voice change register, not loudly, not dramatically, just a tightening of the consonants that she recognized as the vocal signature of a man recalibrating after an unexpected variable, and then the sound of boots on stone moving away. She remained in the gap behind the granite shelf for another hour and 20 minutes, until the membrane's integrity window was approaching its limit, and she needed to make a decision about the next phase of the plan. The next phase of the plan was this: get the Ember to someone who could protect it, and get the lineage record to someone who could use it. The only person who could do both was the Alpha King. She had never met Dorian of the Stonecrest line. She had read every document that referenced him in the Ashvale archive, which was not a small number. She had a precise and detailed picture of his governance, his rulings, his administration of pack law. She knew that he had held court for a contested Omega inheritance and ruled in the Omega's favor. She knew that he had dissolved a corrupt elder council in the Eastern Territories without bloodshed, using documented evidence and formal law rather than force. She knew that he had been described, in a report filed by an Ashvale trade delegation 8 months ago, as a man who was difficult to read and easy to underestimate if you were the kind of person who confused silence with absence. She was not that kind of person. She knew that he held formal court at the Stonecrest seat, which was 2.5 days' travel from Ashvale on horseback and 6 days on foot, and that he was not, according to the same trade delegation report, currently in residence. He was making his annual circuit of the Eastern Territories, which put him, if the circuit held to its documented schedule, approximately 14 hours from Ashvale's northern border. 14 hours. She could move in less than that. She could move quietly, without a horse, without supplies beyond what she could carry, because she had been planning a route through the Ashvale backcountry for 3 months, in the same methodical way she planned everything else, and she had a second canvas pack, not her mother's, a different one, ready in the ventilation passage, with everything she needed for 6 days of travel. What she had not planned for was the state of her own body when it was time to move. She had thought, with the careful rationalism she applied to everything, that the Ember would be painful. She had not thought it would be quite this painful. The treated membrane had held, and she could feel, with the specific kind of internal attention you develop quickly when you are carrying a 260-year-old piece of fire inside your body, that it was still holding, but the heat had migrated upward and settled somewhere between her sternum and the back of her throat, and her body had been making its objections known in the measured, insistent way of a well-maintained machine being asked to operate outside its design specifications. She breathed through it. She picked up the pack. She moved. By the end of the 2nd hour, she had cleared the stronghold's back perimeter through a drainage channel she had mapped from the original fortress plans. By the end of the 4th hour, she was above the tree line on the northern ridge, moving at a pace that was not fast but was continuous, which was a different, and in some ways more sustainable thing. The night was cold in the way mountain nights in the late harvest season are cold. Not dramatically, not with wind or precipitation, just a steady, thorough removal of warmth that started at the extremities and worked inward. She did not have enough warmth to spare. The Ember helped. This struck her, after the first hour above the tree line, as the darkest possible version of a warming fire, and she did not allow herself to dwell on it. The membrane dissolved at the beginning of the 6th hour. She had prepared for this, in the way she prepared for everything. She had known it would dissolve. She had known the coal would extinguish, once separated from its protected environment. She had known that what she would be carrying at that point was the physical remains of the ember, rather than the living fire itself. What she had perhaps not prepared for with full precision was the specific and sudden quality of the absence, the way the heat stopped not gradually, but all at once, like a voice cutting off mid-sentence, and left in its place a cold and specific hollow that she felt as a loss, quite separate from the physical. The fire was out. She stopped walking. She stood on the northern ridge in the dark and took a full inventory. Her body was intact. The coal's remains were still inside her and would pass in their own time. The lineage record was sealed in oilskin in the pack on her back. The valley envoys were at least 3 hours behind her, if they had discovered her absence immediately, which she doubted. She had a route. She had a destination. She started walking again. That was hour 6. By hour 9, she had descended the north face of the ridge and entered the forest corridor that ran between Ashvale territory and the border of Dorian's circuit route. By hour 11, she had forded a tributary stream that was, in this season, cold enough to make her hands cease to be useful for approximately 8 minutes after she came out the other side. She stopped on the far bank, tucked her hands inside her coat against her ribs, and waited the 8 minutes out, with the same quality of patience she had applied to everything since the ventilation passage. By hour 12, she was moving through the forest at reduced speed, because her legs had begun the specific kind of conversation with her that legs have when they have been asked to sustain effort for 12 hours on no food and the hollow aftermath of an internal ember. She answered the conversation by continuing to move. It was not a satisfying response, but it was the only one available. Hour 13, she heard horses. She stopped. She pressed herself against the nearest tree and listened, not with fear, because fear was not a particularly useful tool, but with the precise and focused attention that had kept her alive and functional for 6 years, in an environment where no one was watching out for her. The horses were moving at a trot, on the old border road that ran parallel to the forest corridor, approximately 300 meters to her east. She counted hoofbeats, 4 horses, maybe 5, moving north to south, which meant coming from the direction of the Eastern Territories circuit. She calculated. The circuit schedule, if it had held, put Dorian's party at a specific waypoint this many hours from where she was standing. This was consistent with the sound and direction of the horses. She had been carrying her mother's old formal script and the memory of every document she had ever read in the Ashvale archive and the remains of a 260-year-old fire for 13 hours and 4 minutes through mountain terrain in the cold. She had perhaps 400 meters to cover to reach the road. She unclenched herself from the tree and moved toward the sound. She made it 280 meters before her legs declined to negotiate further, and she went down, not dramatically, not collapsing so much as ceasing, like a sentence that runs out of sentence before it runs out of meaning. She caught herself on one knee and one hand, and the pack hit her between the shoulder blades as it swung forward with her momentum, and she remained there for a moment in the absolute dark of the forest floor, breathing with the careful, metered precision she had been using since the ventilation passage, and thought with the specific clarity of a person who has been running on arithmetic for 13 hours that she needed to make a sound. She had been silent since the tunnel, 11 minutes before the traders arrived, plus 13 hours and some additional minutes since, which was the longest continuous silence she had maintained in 6 years, which was itself the longest continuous silence of her life. She thought about the ember. She thought about what it had cost to swallow it and carry it and feel it go out. She thought about the lineage record in the oilskin, in the pack on her back, which was the only thing standing between Eldercrest's falsified documents and a legal succession argument that would displace a king who had, by every document she had ever read, governed with more care than the law required of him. Then she opened her mouth and made a sound, It was not a shout. She did not have a shout left in her. It was more like a word said at normal volume in a very quiet forest. Her name, and then the Alpha King's title, and then the word record, because those were the three most load-bearing syllables available to her, and she was operating on a strict economy. Dorian of the Stonecrest line felt it before he heard it. He had been riding the Eastern Circuit for 9 days, and in those 9 days his wolf had been increasingly restless in the specific, sourceless way that it was restless when something was wrong in the territory, and he could not locate the wrongness. He had reviewed the circuit reports. He had spoken with every elder council they had stopped to meet. He had found nothing that accounted for it. No visible threat, no treaty violation, no scent on the wind that matched the quality of the unease. His wolf was not satisfied with this accounting. His captain had noticed. His captain had the good sense to say nothing about it. They were on the border road, 4 of them, moving at a trot toward the night's waypoint. When it arrived, not a sound, not first. First, it was a scent, carried on the still night air, and it was unlike anything he had encountered at close range before. Cedar and clove, and something underneath those 2 things, something that had no clean name, something that his wolf identified before his conscious mind had finished processing the cedar. His horse stopped. He had not asked it to stop. It stopped because he had gone still in the saddle with the completeness of a man whose entire body has redirected itself toward a single point in space, and the horse, which was responsive to such things, had drawn the reasonable inference. His wolf said one word. He did not let it out. Then, 280 meters to his west, in the dark of the forest, a voice, controlled, quiet, 3 syllables he could count on a single breath, followed by a title, followed by a word that brought him off his horse, in the same motion as thinking about it. Record. He was through the tree line with a torch, before his captain had finished asking him what he was doing. He moved toward the scent, which was stronger now, and underneath the cedar and the clove there was something else, something that his wolf processed as wrongness of a different kind from the one it had been tracking all week. The specific wrongness of pain, endured without expression, of a body that has spent its resources carefully and is at the end of them. He found her on one knee on the forest floor, canvas pack, travel clothes worn through at the left knee and the right shoulder, dark hair loose from whatever had held it, one hand flat on the ground. Her head came up when his torchlight reached her, and she looked at him with eyes that were absolutely steady and that contained, in his immediate assessment, more controlled information than most formal council reports. She said, before he could speak, "I need to give you something, the lineage record for Ashvale. It's an oilskin. I need a moment before I can stand, but the record is intact." He crouched. He was close enough that the scent hit him at full strength, and his wolf went very quiet in the way it went quiet when it was concentrating, when it was doing something precise and important, and did not need the noise. "How long have you been walking?" he said. 13 hours, she said. 14, approximately. I swallowed the sacred ember to hide it from Elder Crest's associates. The membrane dissolved at hour 6. The fire... She stopped. He watched her recalibrate. "The fire is out," she said. "I'm sorry. I couldn't..." The membrane held for longer than I expected, but not long enough. The coal's remains are still internal. That's not a risk to you. I just want you to have a complete accounting. He looked at her. He thought about the ember she had just told him she had swallowed. He thought about 13 hours on foot, in mountain terrain, in the harvest cold, with a 260-year-old fire burning through a membrane inside her chest. He thought about the word record she had said in the forest dark, at the outer limit of her range, when she could no longer move toward him. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, with the expression of someone who is not accustomed to hands being held out toward her, and then she took it. He brought her to her feet. She stood, She was shaking through her whole frame, the kind of shaking that happens after cold and effort and time, and she bore it with the same quiet precision she bore everything else. "My name is Arya," she said. "Third Record Warden, Ashvale Archive." "Dorian," he said, which she already knew, and which was all he had to offer at the moment, against the full inventory she had just given him. She reached back, one-handed, unsteady, but deliberate, and retrieved the oilskin from the pack. She held it out to him. He took it. "The documents Elder Crest has been using," she said, "are falsified. The originals are sealed in the old formal script, in a ventilation passage behind the granite shelf on the archive's eastern wall. I can give you the precise location. Elder Crest's intermediary cannot read the old formal script, so they won't have found them. You have approximately—" She paused, and he watched her doing the arithmetic, visibly, behind her steady eyes. "You have approximately 6 hours before the morning formal council convenes, if he's moving on the timeline I've projected. That is enough time to reach Ashvale with the original record and prevent the presentation of the falsified succession argument." "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked at him. He looked at her. His wolf was doing something that it did not usually do. It was not pressing him, not insisting, not issuing its short, imperious directives. It was simply present, attentive, oriented toward her, the way compass needles orient toward north, with the steady and unargumentable quality of a thing that has found what it was looking for and does not need to make noise about it. "You need to be seen," he said, "not a question." "I need to give testimony," she said. "The record needs authentication by the warden who maintained it. That is me." "Then you'll ride," he said. "I can walk." "You've been walking," he said, "for 14 hours. You will ride." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right." His captain had caught up to them by then, standing at the tree line with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had served for 6 years and had learned to perform a selective blindness when the Alpha King was doing something that did not require an audience. Dorian handed him the oilskin. He kept Arya's hand. The other wolves felt it before the night was over. Dorian's captain felt it first, a shift in the quality of the Alpha King's attention that was legible to anyone who had spent long enough in proximity to a mated bond and knew what the before looked like. He said nothing. He held the oilskin and rode 3 lengths behind them and revised, in his private accounting, everything he had assumed about the next 12 months. They reached Ashvale in the hour before dawn, the horses moving fast on the road Arya had traversed on foot, and the stronghold's gate guard, a young beta who had worked the night post for 3 years, opened the gate with the speed of a man whose body had made a decision before his brain caught up, because there was something in the air around the arriving party that registered, at a level below thought, as a thing that needed to move out of the way of. The formal council chamber was lit and occupied when Dorian walked in. Elder Crest was seated at the table's head with the focused, prepared stillness of a man who had been waiting for this moment for 2 years. 3 Valley Alliance representatives were present. The first and second wardens were standing to one side, clearly uncertain what they had been called here for, clearly aware that something had gone significantly wrong with someone's plan. Elder Crest looked at Dorian. He looked at the oilskin in Dorian's captain's hands. He looked at Arya, standing at Dorian's right, and his expression did the thing that expressions do when a variable proves to be considerably larger than the calculation had accounted for. A brief, structural recalibration that was almost invisible, and that Arya clocked with the precision of someone who had been watching his expressions for 2 years. "The third record warden," Elder Crest said, "has no standing in a formal council session." "She does now," Dorian said. The room did something, not dramatically. A small, involuntary stillness passed through the wolves present, through the captain, through the gate guard who had followed them in, through both the wardens, the kind of stillness that happens when the air changes composition, and everybody in the room registers the change before any of them has articulated it. It was not a sound, it was not a signal, it was a door that had never been held open, being held open, and everyone in the room understanding, without being told, what that meant. Elder Crest's scribe, the intermediary, the young beta who had been copying documents, was in the room. Arya saw him, he saw her. She held his gaze long enough to let him know that she had known it was him for 11 months, and then she looked away, because he was not the important thing. She set the pack down. She straightened. The fire was still out, would always be out. She had accepted that, somewhere in the 6th hour of the walk, the specific and finite grief of it. But the coal's passage had left a warmth in her chest that the cold had not fully taken, and she stood in the formal council chamber of the stronghold, where she had been invisible for 6 years, and gave her testimony in the old formal script, translating as she went for the assembled council, her voice even and clear, and carrying exactly as far as it needed to carry. It took 40 minutes. It was complete. It was irrefutable. Elder Crest left the council session under formal escort, which was the pack law equivalent of a careful and irreversible door being closed. The Valley representatives left with him. The falsified documents were collected and sealed. The authenticated originals from the ventilation passage were retrieved by the second warden, who had to be guided to the exact location because, in 6 years, she had never thought to ask what Arya knew about the archive's physical geography. Dorian stood at the edge of the council chamber afterward and watched Arya stand very still near the door, holding herself together with the specific quality of effort that his wolf catalogued as something he was not prepared to ignore. She was grey with exhaustion. The controlled steadiness of her eyes had not fractured, but it was working harder than it had been in the forest. He crossed the chamber. He stood close enough that she would have felt the warmth of him, and he kept his voice low, because low was the register that did not require her to perform anything in response. "Is there someone in the stronghold," he said, "who knows how to look after you?" She considered this, honestly, it seemed, because she took a moment before answering. "Not particularly," she said. "Then I will arrange it," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. His wolf held its compass needle stillness. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said. She was quiet. Then, in the careful and specific register of someone who has been keeping a very long inventory and is adding one more line to it. "Thank you." He stayed in Ashvale for 4 days. This was presented, officially, as a continuation of the circuit inspection necessitated by the council situation. This was accurate. It was not, in its totality, the only reason. On the first day, Arya slept for 14 hours in a guest room that the stronghold steward, who had received certain impressions from the quality of the Alpha King's instructions, had prepared with a fire and clean linens and a covered tray of food that did not require utensils. On the second day she woke and ate and sat by the fire for a long time without moving, which was not, she thought, her most productive use of the day, but which her body was conducting independently of her opinion on the matter. On the second evening, Dorian came to the guest room and sat in the chair across from her. They did not talk about Elder Crest or the lineage records or the Valley Alliance pacts or the succession argument that would never now be formally presented. They talked, instead, for approximately 2 hours, about things that Arya could not have predicted she would talk about with an Alpha King, the old formal script, and what had been lost when Pax stopped teaching it, the specific smell of her mother's thread wax, and why cedar and clove was still the first thing she noticed when she entered a new archive, what it had been like to be the third record warden for 6 years, in a place where no one saw you. He listened in the way that people rarely listened, not arranging his response while she spoke, but actually receiving it, the way the old archives received new documents, making space for the shape of the thing. On the third day, he took her back through the archive. She showed him the ventilation passage, the granite shelf, the gap behind it. She showed him where she had crouched for 1 hour and 11 minutes, with the ember burning through its membrane inside her chest. He looked at the space, narrow, cold, utterly dark without a torch, and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "How long did you plan this?" 3 months, she said. The route, the membrane, the timing, the ember itself. That was decided in approximately 4 minutes, when the Valley envoys arrived, and I calculated that it was the only viable option. 4 minutes, he said. The situation was clear, she said. He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as the one he had when he was rearranging something fundamental in his understanding of how a thing worked. It was not quite like any expression she had seen on a face before. On the 4th day, as the horses were being prepared for the circuit's continuation, he stood with her in the stronghold's outer yard and told her that he would be sending a formal document to the Ashvale archive within the week, requesting the transfer of the first record wardenship. The current first warden had submitted a retirement notice as part of the post-council restructuring. She looked at him. "That is not a minor appointment," she said. "No," he said. "I am an Omega," she said. "Third ranked. I have no formal. You read the only language in which the Pack's founding documents are written," he said. "You have maintained and protected the Ashvale Archive's legal integrity for 6 years without recognition or support. You swallowed the Pack's sacred fire and walked for 14 hours through mountain terrain so that the lineage record would survive. These are not the qualifications of a third warden." She was quiet. "The scent of you," he said, and then he stopped, in the way of a man who has said more than he intended, in fewer words than he expected. He started again, more carefully. "The scent of cedar and clove," he said. "I smelled it before I heard you, across 300 meters of still air and dark. I have been in this territory for 9 days, and I have not been able to—" He stopped again. She watched him. She was, perhaps, the most still she had ever been. "I will send the document," he said, "within the week." "All right," she said. He left. He came back inside a month, on the return circuit, which was documented as covering approximately the same geographic ground as the previous one, which was accurate, and which did not fully account for the fact that the Ashvale branch of the return circuit covered approximately twice the time of its predecessor, and that his captain had stopped making any notation of this in the official log. The second visit was shorter on formal business, and longer on the things they had found themselves talking about in the guest room on the second evening. The scent of her, at close range, had done something irreversible to his internal accounting of the world. He was not a man who used that word lightly. His wolf used no words at all. It was simply, at all times when he was within the stronghold walls, oriented toward the archive on the eastern side of the building, with the compass needle quality that did not argue, and did not moderate, and did not require his participation. He asked her, on the 3rd evening of the second visit, whether she had felt the change. She considered this with the honesty she applied to everything. "Yes," she said, "since the forest, since you held out your hand." "Before that," he said. "For me, it was before that." She looked at him. "The scent," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Cedar and clove is my mother's thread wax, from the pack she carried. I have had it on my hands since I arrived here." "I know what cedar and clove smell like," he said, and his voice had something in it that was not quite dry and not quite tender, but was a precise position between the two. "That is not what I was describing." She held his gaze. Her chest, where the ember had been, ached in a way that was entirely different from the burn, warmer and directional, oriented toward him with the same quality as his wolf's silent attention. "I know," she said. "The claiming was not a ceremony. and not a spectacle. It was quiet, and it was chosen, and it was irrevocable, and every wolf in the stronghold registered it the morning after, through the specific and involuntary shift in the air, the stillness that moved through the great hall like a current through still water, the averted eyes, the half-step of space that opened around Arya when she came down to the archive that morning, the way the new First Warden's door, which had been her door for 6 weeks now, was held open by a senior guardsman who had never in 6 years held a door for the third record warden, and who did so now with the careful naturalness of a man who has recalibrated an assumption and sees no need to comment on the recalibration. The pack knew. They knew before any announcement, before any formal presentation, before Dorian stood before any council. They knew because their bodies told them, because the bond was in the air, and the bond did not require a decree. The formal announcement came later. Arya stood beside Dorian for it, in the great hall, in the same room where she had eaten after everyone else had finished for 6 years, and she stood there, in the precise and unflinching way she stood everywhere, and the hall was full, and no one in it looked through her. She still kept the archive. She kept it more thoroughly than it had ever been kept, because she had resources now that the Third Warden's alcove had not afforded. Additional staff. She had trained herself in the old formal script, a proper cataloging system, and the specific form of authority that makes people ask your name before they walk past you. She kept the archive because it was good work, and because the work had made her who she was, and because, she thought, the 260 years of the Ashvale Pack's history deserved someone who read the language it was written in. Dorian moved the circuit schedule to orbit Ashvale at shorter intervals. This was documented as an administrative decision related to the post-council restructuring. His captain made no notation in the official log regarding the interval's correlation with anything else. They had been bonded for 2 years when Arya first held the things she had not, during the 3 months of planning for the Ember and the forest and the document, included in her formal accounting of the future, because it was not a thing that planning could fully prepare you for, and she had always known, somewhere below her careful arithmetic, that there were categories of life that operated outside the planning register entirely. She held it the way she held everything important, carefully, and with her full attention, and without flinching. The small warmth of it against her chest was nothing like the ember's burn, and everything like what the ember had been trying to tell her, she thought, in those 6 hours before it went out. A warmth that was alive, a warmth that was sustained not by a membrane dissolving around it, but by the fact of her holding it, and by Dorian's hand, steady and close, at her back. What she understood now, sitting in the archive's main chamber in the late afternoon light, with the old formal script open on the desk beside her, and the small carved ironstone vessel that Dorian had commissioned from the pack's eldest craftsman sitting on the shelf above it, a replica of the original, empty, kept as a record rather than a vessel. What she understood now was that the fire had not ended in the 6th hour. It had changed containers. She had carried it to the place where it needed to go. That was all. That was the whole of it. The archive was quiet. The autumn light came through the eastern window in the way it always came, gold and specific, finding the dust on the shelves and making it visible and briefly beautiful. The baby made no sound. He was sleeping, his small face composed and perfect against her chest, one fist curled against his own cheek. Dorian came in without knocking, because he never knocked at the archive door anymore, and he stood for a moment in the doorway with the expression he had when he was rearranging something fundamental, except that the rearranging was complete now, had been complete for some time, and what remained was the expression itself, settled into something that was not quite contentment and not quite reverence, but was a precise and specific position between the two. "Still working?" he said. "The Mirren documents won't catalogue themselves," she said. He crossed the room. He stood beside her chair and looked at their son's sleeping face, and then at her face, and his hand came to rest at her shoulder with the same quiet authority as everything else he did, not demonstrative, not performed, just present. The mark at the curve of her neck pulsed once, warm. She turned a page. The Mirren documents were a particular kind of problem, not difficult precisely, but layered in the way that the oldest records always were, written in a formal script that had been through 3 regional variations before settling into the standardized version Arya had learned from her mother, and requiring cross-reference against 2 other document sets before any single entry could be considered fully authenticated. She had been working on them for 11 days. She expected to finish in another 9. Dorian had stopped asking when she would be done with them because he had learned, over 2 years, that her estimates were precise and her timelines were not a negotiation. He sat down in the second chair, the chair that had not existed in the archive before his second visit, and that had appeared between one day and the next, without comment from either of them, as though it had always been there, as though the room had simply been waiting to express a fact it already knew. He did not read. He watched her work for a while, in the comfortable silence of a man who has learned that presence is its own form of company and does not require augmentation. The baby shifted against her chest without waking. His scent, warm, milky, carrying the specific note that Dorian's wolf identified as the pack's deepest claim, the thing that broadcasted lineage to every wolf at close range, filled the archive's air, alongside cedar and clove and old paper. It was a combination that should not have been cohesive, and was, completely. "The craftsman finished the second vessel," Dorian said. Arya looked up from the Mirren documents. "The companion piece?" "Yes. He wants to know if you approve the dimensions before he seals it." She thought about this. The original ironstone vessel on the shelf above her desk held its shape in her memory as precisely as any document she had catalogued. The slight asymmetry of the lid, the wear on the right side where generations of hearthkeepers had gripped it. The companion piece was meant to sit beside it, not as a replacement, but as an acknowledgement. 2 vessels, one empty, one to be filled again. "I'll look at it tomorrow," she said. "Tell him the proportions in the original drawing were correct. He should trust his measurement." "He trusts yours," Dorian said. She returned to the Mirren documents. Dorian remained in the second chair. Outside the eastern window, the autumn light was thinning toward evening, in the gradual way of late-season light, not disappearing so much as softening by degrees, until the gold became amber, became the particular grey-blue of a mountain dusk. She had not been back to the ventilation passage since the day she showed it to Dorian. This was not avoidance. She had simply not needed to go there. The gap behind the granite shelf had served its purpose. The drainage channel through the stronghold's back perimeter was still there, still mapped in the original fortress plans, still known only to her and now to Dorian, who had looked at it during the archive tour with the expression of a man filing a piece of information in a location where it would not be lost. The Valley Alliance packs had been quiet for 8 months. This was not the same as resolved. She tracked the dispatches as they came through, read them with the same systematic attention she gave everything, and maintained a separate file of her own observations that she updated every 2 weeks. Dorian read her files. He did not always say so. She knew because the specific lines she had flagged for his attention tended to produce administrative responses within the week following her updates, timed with a consistency that was not accidental. They had not discussed this arrangement formally. They did not need to. "Your captain," she said, not looking up from the document she was transcribing, "sent a dispatch this morning. I saw it on the table in the outer hall." "He thinks I don't know how quickly you read the outer hall table," Dorian said. "He knows you know. He leaves things there anyway." "Yes," Dorian said. "He does." A pause. The baby made a small sound and subsided. Arya turned the document by a few degrees to catch the remaining light better. "The eastern settlements are sending a new trade delegation," she said. Second one this season. The timing is not coincidental. No, Dorian agreed. The Third Valley Alliance pack has a succession event pending. Their alpha is aging, and the heir is young and untested. Someone is going to try to leverage that. The question is whether they try through formal council argument again, or through something less documented. She paused. I think less documented. Elder Crest's failure was a public failure. They will not repeat the mechanism. What do you recommend? She looked up then. This was a thing that had taken some adjustment, being asked. For 6 years, she had conducted her analysis in the complete privacy of her own mind, because there had been no one to ask it of. The adjustment was not difficult, exactly. It was more like learning to speak a language she had been reading silently for years, finding that the sounds were already formed in her, that they had been waiting for a listener. Preemptive documentation, she said. The Eastern Territory's bloodline records have 3 gaps in the last generation that could be exploited in a succession argument. I can close 2 of them with materials already in the Ashvale archive. The third requires a direct inquiry to the Mirren border settlements. There are record keepers there who hold the originals. If we request those materials formally, through the council, before anyone else has reason to request them, the gaps are closed and the leverage disappears. Dorian nodded. Draft the formal request. I'll countersign it tomorrow. I already drafted it, she said. It's under the Mirren documents. He looked at her. The expression was the rearranging one, except that what he was rearranging now was not his understanding of how a thing worked, but something quieter and more interior. The ongoing, daily revision of a man who has found something he did not know he was looking for, and continues, 2 years later, to take its measure. Cedar and clove, he said, not quite to her, in the register of a man completing a thought he had been having privately. I know what you're doing, she said. I'm not doing anything. You're doing the thing where you name the scent because you're not going to say the other thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the other thing is that I have been able to locate you in this building from any room in it for 2 years, and I am not certain I was capable of being in any room where I couldn't for very long. She set down her pen. She looked at him fully, the way she looked at documents that required her full attention, not softened, not performed, just completely present. The mark, she said. It was not a question. Not only the mark, he said. The mark site at the curve of her neck pulsed again, warm, the way it did when he was close, the way it had been doing since the morning after the claiming, steady and habitual as a heartbeat. She had stopped noticing it, as a separate sensation months ago. It was simply part of the texture of her days now, the way the cedar and clove smell of her mother's pack was part of the texture of the archive, present and informing everything, and not requiring acknowledgement to be real. The fire, she said, after a moment. Dorian looked at her. I have been thinking about the fire, she said, what it meant that it went out in the 6th hour. I spent a considerable amount of time, in the early months, treating it as a failure, a partial failure. I had intended the membrane to hold longer. I had intended to deliver the Ember alive. You delivered the record, he said. The record was what mattered legally. I know, she said. I arrived at that understanding eventually. What I arrived at more recently. She paused and looked at the ironstone vessel on the shelf, the empty replica, the record of a thing that had been kept for 260 years. What I arrived at more recently is that the Ember was never going to survive the journey as an Ember. The membrane was the best available option, and it held for as long as it could hold, and then it dissolved. The fire went out. Those are the facts. She paused again. But the pack did not go dark. The archive held. The lineage record survived. The succession argument failed. Every wolf in this stronghold still knows where they come from. The fire went out inside me, and the pack did not go dark. Dorian was very still. "I am saying," she said, with the plain precision of a woman who has spent considerable time with a thought and is now delivering it in its final form, that the fire did its work before it ended, that carrying it was not a failure because it didn't survive. The carrying was the point. The 14 hours were the point. "Arya," he said. She looked at him. He had her name in his voice, the way the archive had her work, as something that had become so integral to the structure that removing it would change the nature of the thing itself. "The craftsman's second vessel," she said. "When it's finished, and the dimensions are right, and I've approved it, I want it to hold a new fire, not a preserved coal, a new one, lit fresh." He understood her immediately, the way he understood everything she said, which was one of the things she had not included in her formal accounting of what she wanted from the rest of her life, and which had turned out to be among the most significant items on the list. "From the hearthkeeper," he said. "From us," she said, "together, with the pack as witness." He was quiet, for long enough that she began, in the methodical way she had of being wrong about things, to wonder if she had misjudged the weight of what she was proposing. Then he leaned forward, and his hand covered hers on the desk, over the Mirren documents, over the formal request she had drafted before he asked her to draft it, over the old formal script that no one else in the room could read. "Yes," he said. Nothing more than that. The word carried everything it needed to carry without ornamentation, the way his words always did, the way hers did. A short declarative sentence that was also a door opened, and a boundary agreed on, and a future decided, all at once, in one syllable. The baby woke then, with the absolute disregard for timing that was already his most consistent characteristic at 5 weeks of age, and made the specific sound that Arya had learned to distinguish from the general vocabulary of his small communications as the one that meant he was not immediately satisfied with his current arrangements. She shifted him without putting down her pen, an act of logistics that had taken 2 weeks to master, and that she had now integrated so completely into the rhythm of the archive that it no longer interrupted the work. Dorian watched her manage this with the expression that was not quite contentment and not quite reverence. He picked up the formal request from under the Mirren documents, read it through once with the focused speed of a man who had been reading her drafts for 2 years and had learned to trust their completeness, and reached for the pen she kept on the left side of the desk. He countersigned it that evening, a day earlier than he had said. She noted this without comment, filed it under the Mirren correspondence, and returned to the document she had been transcribing when the light was still gold. The light was entirely gone now. The iron stove, the one that had replaced the inadequate original in the first month of her first wardenship, held the room at a steady warmth. The fire in it was unremarkable and sufficient, and had been burning without interruption since autumn began. It did not need to be 260 years old to do its work. It only needed to burn.